On July 3rd, 1863, while Confederate troops charged toward Cemetery Ridge in what became known as Pickett's Charge, something strange moved across the fields of Gettysburg. Among the cries of the wounded, a woman named Elizabeth Caldwell walked calmly, tending to the dying with hands that seemed untouched by time. Soldiers swore that she was the same woman who had delivered their children decades earlier in Baltimore, unchanged in appearance, as if the years had passed her by without notice. Surgeons confirmed her presence. Town records carried her signature, and yet medical journals could offer no explanation for what witnesses had seen. By 1864, the Army's medical department sealed her file, hiding it from public view for almost a century. But Elizabeth's story didn't begin on the battlefield. It began in Baltimore in 1840, a thriving port city where immigrants poured in by ship, where railroads carried goods west, and where outbreaks of disease tested the limits of medical science. In this city, young doctors competed to make their names in hospitals and universities. And it was here that Dr. Cornelius Hartwell first met Elizabeth Caldwell. She had come to his Charles Street clinic complaining of fatigue. He noted her appearance in careful detail: about 28 years old, auburn hair, green eyes, and a pale complexion, typical of well-bred women of the time. Her husband, Thomas Caldwell, ran a successful shipping business, moving tobacco and manufactured goods throughout the Chesapeake. Together they lived a quiet, respectable life in a townhouse near Monument Street, attending church regularly and raising a family. Nothing about them seemed unusual, except for what time would reveal. For the next 23 years, Elizabeth remained a patient of Dr. Hartwell and later other physicians. Her file at Mercy General Hospital shows the routine details of a respectable woman's life: childbirths, seasonal ailments, regular checkups. But buried within those records was a discovery that no physician could ignore. Across more than 2 decades, Elizabeth Caldwell showed no sign of aging. Each doctor who examined her came to the same baffling conclusion: her body refused to follow the natural laws of time. Elizabeth Caldwell's medical file reads like an argument against nature itself. Her height never changed from 5 feet 4 inches, her weight shifted only slightly with the seasons, and her bone density showed none of the expected decline of a woman nearing middle age. In the Baltimore of the 1850s, physicians worked under strict protocols set by the Maryland State Medical Society, keeping detailed patient files, publishing unusual cases in the Baltimore Medical Journal, and subjecting one another's work to scrutiny during society meetings. When Dr. Cornelius Hartwell first raised Elizabeth's case at a meeting in 1855, suggesting she might be aging at a fraction of the normal rate, his colleagues laughed it off as sloppy record-keeping. Yet as more physicians encountered her during childbirths, minor injuries, and family consultations, the laughter turned uneasy. Independent doctors trained at different schools, working in different specialties, were all recording the same impossible fact: Elizabeth Caldwell was aging at perhaps 1/3 the speed of everyone else. Meanwhile, her husband's shipping business prospered through the boom years, giving the family a comfortable life and a respected place in Baltimore society. Elizabeth gave birth to 3 children between 1842 and 1848. Margaret Thomas Jr. and Sarah, each delivery attended by different doctors who noted her swift recoveries and unchanged appearance. Among Baltimore's social circles, whispers began to circulate. Some women speculated she must be using exotic European cosmetics, though no one could point to any product capable of such results. Her minister, Reverend Samuel Wickham, recorded in his diary that she looked exactly the same in 1860 as she had in 1841, calling her condition a mystery of divine providence that challenged the very order of earthly life. But as the 1850s drew to a close, the city itself became a battlefield of divided loyalties. Baltimore sat uneasily on the Mason-Dixon line, a city of both northern industry and southern sympathy. For Thomas Caldwell, neutrality had been good business. His ships carried goods to ports on both sides. Yet when war broke out in 1861, neutrality collapsed under the weight of bayonets and cannon fire. The illusion of distance from the conflict shattered on April 19, 1861, during the Baltimore riot. Union troops of the 6th Massachusetts Infantry were marching through the city when Confederate sympathizers ambushed them near Camden Station. Stones and gunfire tore through the narrow streets, leaving 4 soldiers and a dozen civilians dead and many more bleeding on the cobblestones. Into this chaos stepped Elizabeth Caldwell. The surviving records cannot agree on why she was there. Some claimed she had been shopping at Lexington Market. Others said she had gone to meet relatives arriving by train. What no one disputed was how she responded once the violence erupted. Witnesses told a military tribunal that she tore strips from her own petticoats to staunch wounds, calmed panicked soldiers with a steady voice, and marshaled bystanders into an impromptu medical team. By the time Dr. Marcus Fleming, chief surgeon of University Hospital, reached the station 20 minutes later, he found Elizabeth already running a makeshift field hospital inside Hearst's warehouse. What he saw that day defied every assumption he held about civilians and battlefield medicine and ensured that Elizabeth Caldwell would never again be dismissed as a curiosity. Elizabeth Caldwell's work at the Baltimore riot stunned everyone who witnessed it. Inside the improvised hospital she had arranged with remarkable discipline, the wounded were separated by urgency. Clean and contaminated areas were clearly marked, and infection control practices were enforced at a level many major hospitals of the era failed to match. Dr. Marcus Fleming, who had seen countless cases of battlefield chaos, admitted in his report to the Maryland State Medical Board that Elizabeth's knowledge of anatomy and surgery was equal to that of a formally trained physician. She used precise medical terminology, demonstrated advanced techniques in wound management, and carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to treating traumatic injuries. When pressed about her background, she claimed to have learned only from tending to family matters and reading her husband's medical books, an explanation Dr. Fleming found impossible to believe. Her medical competence was strange enough, but what alarmed investigators more was the growing body of testimony about her unchanging appearance. 7 different witnesses, interviewed separately, described meeting Elizabeth in years long past, each insisting she looked exactly the same in 1861 as she had decades earlier. Patrick Ali, an Irish immigrant, swore she had delivered his child in 1845, even recalling the scar on her left hand from a childhood mishap. A Confederate sympathizer wounded during the riot testified that she had treated his brother after a dock accident in 1847. And looked no older now than she had then. Most unsettling of all was Union Captain James Hricks, who claimed she had attended his wedding in 1843, wearing the same emerald earrings she now wore in the streets of Baltimore 18 years later. Dr. Fleming closed his report with a warning. He urged the military to take note of Elizabeth Caldwell should she appear at future battles. Her medical expertise, he wrote, was more advanced than many surgeons under his command. And her apparent resistance to aging, though unexplainable by any known science, deserved further investigation. His recommendation marked a turning point. From that day forward, Elizabeth Caldwell was no longer a curiosity whispered about in medical circles. She became a name officially tracked by military records. As the Civil War escalated and Union and Confederate forces braced for larger and bloodier engagements, Elizabeth's story moved from rumor into official documentation. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Union Army's medical director, and the man responsible for modernizing battlefield medicine, received Fleming's report and filed it alongside a growing collection of unexplained anomalies. When the armies marched toward Gettysburg 2 years later, he would not have to wait long to see for himself the woman whose existence defied every law of human biology. The Civil War became a grim laboratory for medicine, with doctors facing injuries and illnesses on a scale no peacetime practice had ever prepared them for. Reports circulated of soldiers surviving wounds that should have been fatal, of infections receding against all odds, and of patients recovering with baffling speed. Yet none of these cases carried the same weight of documentation or the same aura of unease as Elizabeth Caldwell, the woman who did not seem to age. While the war expanded medical knowledge, it destroyed the Caldwell family's fortunes. Thomas's shipping business collapsed within months of the Baltimore riot. Southern clients refused to trade with a man whose wife had aided Union soldiers, while Union authorities mistrusted him for his earlier contracts with Confederate ports and his family's Virginia ties. By the end of 1861, the Caldwells had lost their Baltimore properties to creditors and were cut off from polite society, rejected by both North and South. But Elizabeth herself seemed to thrive in this new reality. Instead of retreating, she threw herself into hospital work. By 1862, she was a familiar figure in Baltimore's military wards, her skills sharpening at a pace that left seasoned physicians unsettled. Records from that year show patients under her care recovering at rates nearly double the average. Soldiers ravaged by typhoid dysentery and infected wounds consistently fared better when Elizabeth treated them. Dr. Rutledge, still her personal physician, despite her family's fall from status, confessed his astonishment in a February 1862 note. She spoke of surgical techniques he had only learned after years of study and of fracture treatments taught by professors trained in Europe. When pressed, she claimed to have picked it up through natural aptitude and careful observation. Explanations Rutledge found wholly inadequate. The most disturbing reports, however, came not from doctors, but from the soldiers themselves. The hospital chaplain kept daily logs of his rounds, and over, patients described the same uncanny details. They spoke of dreams in which Elizabeth was always present, tending them at all hours, even when official records placed her off duty. Some remembered her voice in the night, guiding them through fevered hallucinations. Others claimed she moved between bedsides with tireless energy, while every other nurse eventually collapsed from fatigue. Private William Kerner of the 2nd Maryland Infantry captured the sentiment in a letter home. She never seemed to tire, never changed from one day to the next, while the rest of us showed the weight of this terrible war. Other nurses would collapse after 12 hours. But Mrs. Caldwell was the same morning and night, as if time itself had no claim on her. It was as if Elizabeth Caldwell stood apart from the very rules of existence that governed everyone else, immune to the exhaustion and decay that marked every soldier and nurse in the war's hospitals. By the spring of 1863, her reputation had spread through the Union Army's Medical Corps, where she was both admired and feared. Surgeons asked for her by name when cases seemed beyond hope. Yet in their private letters, they confessed unease about her uncanny knowledge. Soldiers spoke of her with reverence, though beneath their gratitude lay a quiet dread they could not explain. She had become a paradox essential to the war effort, yet impossible to fit into the rational framework of science. Her life might have remained confined to the wards of Baltimore, had it not been for a chance meeting that May. Clara Barton, already renowned as the angel of the battlefield, visited Jarvis Hospital to observe treatment methods she could apply closer to the front. She spent only 2 hours with Elizabeth Caldwell, but the encounter left a mark Barton could not shake. In a letter to her sister, Barton wrote of a woman whose medical skills surpassed most veteran physicians, yet whose very presence unsettled her. She described Elizabeth as younger in appearance than herself, though she spoke of wounds and illnesses as if she had seen them countless times before, and more strangely described future battles as though she already knew what injuries would result. Barton could not name the source of her unease, but she urged military planners to assign Elizabeth Caldwell wherever the fighting grew fiercest. That recommendation carried weight. When Union forces massed in Pennsylvania in June 1863, preparing for what would become the Battle of Gettysburg, orders were given for Elizabeth Caldwell to accompany the Army of the Potomac's Medical Corps. This was no ordinary deployment. Dr. Jonathan Letterman's newly reformed ambulance corps brought together more than 650 surgeons, assistant surgeons, and stewards, the largest concentration of medical professionals in American history up to that time. Every detail of the coming battle would be documented with precision, and among these hundreds of trained observers, Elizabeth Caldwell was already the subject of fascination. Word of the Baltimore woman who had not aged in 20 years had traveled across the Union, and her presence at Gettysburg ensured she would be scrutinized more closely than ever before. She arrived in town on June 28, 1863, traveling with a convoy of medical supplies donated by Baltimore families and escorted by nurses from local Presbyterian congregations. Gettysburg itself, with barely 400 residents, was already groaning under the strain of two armies converging upon it. Local physician Dr. Robert Horner, whose family had served Adams County for generations, agreed to lodge several female volunteers in his Baltimore Street home. That evening, he wrote in his journal of his first encounter with Elizabeth Caldwell. He was immediately struck by her appearance, which seemed impossibly youthful for a woman with her depth of medical experience. In his words, she spoke with the authority of someone who had weathered countless campaigns, yet bore not a trace of the years that such experience should leave behind. Dr. Robert Horner's suspicions only deepened as his encounters with Elizabeth Caldwell grew more unsettling. When he casually remarked that she reminded him of a young woman he had met during his medical training in Philadelphia 2 decades earlier, she quickly deflected, steering the conversation toward practical matters like the town's water supply. Later that night, curiosity led him to his old notebooks. There, written in his own hand in 1843, was a description of a Miss Elizabeth Hartwell who had assisted in a surgery at Pennsylvania Hospital. The details matched perfectly the distinctive birthmark by her left ear, the unusual green eyes, even her manner of speaking. The impossibility of it that this Miss Hartwell and the woman in his parlor could be the same person untouched by 20 years gnawed at him. The next morning, his unease sharpened. Elizabeth's surgical kit contained tools of a quality rarely seen in America, some marked by European manufacturers who had only recently begun exporting such instruments. The scalpels were German steel, polished smooth by decades of use. The suturing thread of a grade so costly most American doctors could not afford it bore the wear of countless procedures. Her medical texts raised even more questions. They spanned 15 years of publication, yet all bore annotations in what appeared to be the same hand, her hand. The ink varied in age, as if she had written them across decades of study, but the handwriting had not changed at all. On June 30th, as Union and Confederate troops maneuvered around Gettysburg, Elizabeth asked permission to scout the countryside for hospital sites. Horner accompanied her, and what he witnessed disturbed him even further. She walked the fields as if she already knew them, pointing out hidden springs, subtle drainage patterns, and elevation shifts with the confidence of someone who had studied detailed maps unavailable to the public. Most unnerving was her tactical foresight. On Cemetery Ridge, near a modest copse of trees, she stopped and declared, "Here we will see the worst of it. Prepare for abdominal wounds and amputations." No orders had yet been issued. No commanders had revealed their plans. Yet when the fighting erupted the next day, her words proved chillingly accurate. The first day of Gettysburg plunged Elizabeth into the thick of combat medicine. Unlike other civilian volunteers who staggered at the horror, she stepped into the chaos with calm precision. Surgeon Charles McMillan of the 1st Minnesota recorded that she labored 18 hours straight without faltering, performing procedures with a mastery that outpaced trained military doctors. Her composure unbroken amid the blasts of artillery and the cries of the dying. But it was that night, July 1st, 1863, when the most unsettling accounts surfaced. Multiple witnesses swore they saw Elizabeth Caldwell in places she could not have been tending to men at distant corners of the battlefield. At the same moment, others swore she was with them, as if she moved outside the limits of human time and presence. By the night of July 1st, the flicker of candles and oil lamps revealed something that unsettled even hardened battlefield veterans. Men swore they saw Elizabeth Caldwell working in 3 different hospitals at once: the Lutheran Seminary, the Catholic Church, and a barn near Rock Creek. At first, William Crawford, a hospital steward, chalked it up to exhaustion. The roads were jammed with wagons and soldiers, and the chaos made mistakes easy. But when others came forward with the same accounts, the uneasy question arose: were there several women who looked exactly like Elizabeth? Or was she moving in a way no ordinary person could? The second day of Gettysburg brought bloodshed on a scale that pushed 19th century medicine to its breaking point. Confederate forces struck hard on both flanks, and field hospitals overflowed within hours. Churches, barns, and private homes turned into surgical theaters packed with the cries of men awaiting amputation or death. Volunteers fainted, surgeons collapsed, yet Elizabeth pressed on with a tireless energy that defied comprehension. What made her more disturbing, though, was not her stamina, but her impossible presence. Dr. Cyrus Bacon, Harvard-trained and chief surgeon of the Second Corps, kept meticulous logs of every assignment. His records clearly placed Elizabeth at the Jacob Schwartz farm south of town. Yet surgeons elsewhere swore she was at the Granite Schoolhouse to the north, the Spangler Farm to the east, and the Bryan House on Cemetery Ridge, all on the same day. To settle the matter, Bacon personally followed her from the Schwartz farm along the Baltimore Pike on the afternoon of July 2nd. She walked at an ordinary pace, her bag in hand, no sign of haste. Artillery fire forced Bacon to dive for cover, and when the barrage lifted, barely 10 minutes later, he hurried to the Spangler farm. There she was, already elbow-deep in surgery, her apron wet with blood, and assistants insisting she had been there since morning. The distances involved made this flatly impossible. Yet the evidence was before his eyes. More troubling still was testimony from those she treated. Sergeant Major Patrick O'Brien of the Irish Brigade recalled being carried into a barn hospital at the Wentz farm, bleeding out from a shattered shoulder. Through the haze of pain, he swore he saw Elizabeth tending a Confederate officer, speaking fluent German about the man's hometown in Bavaria and naming his children. Later, O'Brien learned the officer had arrived unconscious and died without uttering a word. How then could she have known such personal details? These incidents forced Union medical officers into an uneasy inquiry. A dozen surgeons coordinated signals across the battlefield to track her movements during July 2. Their compiled report described a pattern no military planner could explain. Elizabeth Caldwell appeared simultaneously in places miles apart. Her presence confirmed by men trained to record details with scientific rigor. What began as rumor now became something more, a body of testimony too consistent, too widespread, and too precise to dismiss. Elizabeth Caldwell's presence at Gettysburg pushed even the most skeptical minds to their breaking point. What What had begun as rumor among soldiers and whispers in Baltimore hospitals now stood recorded in official reports, journals, and testimony from men trained to value evidence above superstition. She was not simply tireless, she was impossible. Dr. Ferdinand Vanderkeff, a Prussian-trained surgeon with a reputation for scientific rigor, decided that anecdotal accounts were no longer enough. Using synchronized Swiss pocket watches and a network of colleagues stationed across the battlefield, he created the most precise system of observation the Army Medical Department had ever attempted. His findings, written in meticulous German, were as unsettling as they were undeniable. Elizabeth's body temperature never wavered from 97.8 degrees even under brutal July heat. Her pulse remained steady at 68 beats per minute, no matter how grueling the surgery or how chaotic the fighting around her became. She did not sweat, though she worked for 14 hours straight in heavy clothing. In every measurable way, her physiology seemed alien to the doctors who studied her. And then came July 3rd. Gettysburg awoke under oppressive heat, but by early afternoon, the weather was forgotten in the roar of the largest artillery bombardment in North American history. Confederate guns thundered for nearly 2 hours, shaking the ground in preparation for Pickett's doomed assault on Cemetery Ridge. It was during this firestorm that Elizabeth Caldwell's legend became unshakable. At least 15 independent observers documented her movements under bombardment. Colonel Theodore Lyman, aide to General Meade, wrote the most chilling account. Through his field glasses, he watched her coordinate evacuations with uncanny foresight, pulling men from hospitals seconds before they were reduced to rubble, guiding stretcher bearers away from roads just before shells struck them, and somehow managing to perform surgery in zones that seemed untouched while everything around them burned. She did not hesitate, did not panic, and seemed to know exactly where each round would land before it fell. Even more disturbing was her apparent ability to be in two places at once. Lyman swore he saw her with his own eyes at Rock Creek Hospital at 1:30 p.m. Yet hospital records prove she was performing surgery on an artillery officer at Tinytown Road Station at that same time. To accept one account meant dismissing the other, but both came from credible witnesses corroborated by men who had nothing to gain from fabrication. Lyman's most haunting detail was not her composure or her foresight, but what his German optics revealed under the blazing sun. Elizabeth Caldwell, moving through smoke and fire, cast no discernible shadow. Her dress impossibly remained white, untouched by soot blood, or the grime that clung to every other soul on Cemetery Ridge. It was as if she existed slightly apart from the battlefield itself, present and yet not bound by its ruin. Dr. Daniel Hand's log from July 3, 1863, captures perhaps the most unsettling picture of Elizabeth Caldwell's presence on the battlefield. Working in a barn near Cemetery Ridge, he recorded her stepping into his surgeries with the composure of a trained physician. During Private Henderson's amputation, she anticipated every step, scalpels, sutures, clamps, without a word spoken. Hand marveled not only at her surgical precision, but also at her unshaken calm beneath a storm of artillery fire. When he asked how she could endure it, she replied in a flat tone, "I have seen worse than this, doctor. Much worse." Those words carried the weight of experiences no woman of her supposed age and station should ever have endured. Hand's notes grow stranger still. He wrote that Elizabeth seemed to know the conditions of the wounded before examinations confirmed them, directing him toward hidden internal injuries with uncanny accuracy. Every assessment proved correct. She also spoke to dying soldiers in their native tongues, Polish, Italian, Swedish, and others with fluency impossible for a woman raised in Baltimore. When pressed, she claimed only that she had learned from those who suffered before. The implication that she had been among the dying of many nations across time was a notion Hand dared not believe, yet he wrote it anyway. Journalists also witnessed her impossible nature. Captain Samuel Wilkson of the New York Tribune described a Confederate shell striking a hospital roof at 2:15 p.m., collapsing the structure in a shower of splinters. By all logic, dozens should have been killed. Instead, Wilkson found every patient had been moved to safety moments before impact, though there had been no warning. Elizabeth stood calmly among the debris, her white dress immaculate, directing the continued care of the wounded as if the bombardment were a minor inconvenience. When the cannon fire ceased and Pickett's men advanced across the open fields, Elizabeth became a figure impossible to ignore. 15,000 Confederates marched into the maw of Union guns, and on Cemetery Ridge, Elizabeth moved with them not as a soldier, but as something beyond one. Captain Henry Abbott of the 20th Massachusetts left one of the most detailed accounts. He wrote that she walked the defensive line during the height of the assault, tending to the fallen as musket balls hissed through the air. Not once did she flinch. Not once was she struck, though she never sought cover. Abbott's testimony becomes most chilling in its contradictions. He personally saw her treating Captain Williams near the copse of trees, while his lieutenant swore she was 50 yards to the right at that exact moment. Both men insisted they were not mistaken. Then came the climax of the charge, hand-to-hand combat across the stone wall. Union and Confederate soldiers clashed in brutal chaos, and still Elizabeth was there moving among the dying, untouched by bayonet or bullet. To Abbott, it seemed she was not bound by the same laws of time, space, or mortality as the rest of them. Through the chaos of Pickett's charge, Elizabeth Caldwell became something no battlefield had ever witnessed before. Amid bayonets and musket fire, she moved with serene composure, her presence so commanding that even violence itself seemed to hesitate. Captain Henry Abbott's testimony includes one moment that defied every instinct of war. Elizabeth stepped directly between a Union soldier and a Confederate officer locked in hand-to-hand combat. Without raising her voice, she spoke words neither could later recall. Yet both lowered their weapons and stepped back as if compelled by a force beyond their will. Neither man could explain the sudden peace that overtook them, only that they could not resist her. The most extraordinary account of that day came from Confederate Colonel Lewis Armistead. Mortally wounded during the desperate breach near the copse of trees, his deathbed words to Union Chaplain Father Corby recorded an encounter that still unsettles historians. Armistead described a woman in white who knelt beside him, speaking intimately of his family in Virginia, of children he would never hold again, of secrets from his Mexican War service never written in any record. When he asked who she was, Elizabeth replied, "I am someone who has walked too many battlefields, Colonel. Someone who has seen too much death." He said her touch eased his pain, filling him with a peace he had not known since childhood, though her eyes carried the sorrow of centuries. When the Confederate charge collapsed around 3:30 p.m., the fields before Cemetery Ridge became a vast sea of the wounded and the dying. It was the largest single concentration of casualties Elizabeth Caldwell had ever faced, and the scale of her work left behind a mountain of testimony. Survivors remembered her not just as a healer, but as something uncanny. Private Louis Bissell of the 14th Connecticut recalled her presence as both merciful and terrifying. When she touched his shattered leg, his pain vanished, yet he felt an unnatural coldness flow through him. Her words to him carried the weight of someone who had comforted thousands of dying men across untold years. He remembered her hands most vividly, smooth, unlined, untouched by time or toil, as though the decades she claimed to have lived had never passed at all. Doctors, too, were left with chilling records. Dr. Justin Dwinell of the 2nd Vermont Infantry documented Elizabeth's triage with clinical precision. She moved swiftly among Confederate wounded, identifying who could be saved and who could not with unerring accuracy. Every soldier she deemed beyond hope died within hours, despite the best efforts of surgeons, while those she selected for treatment survived wounds that should have killed them. When pressed for her method, she told Dwinell, "I can see the shadow of death in those who will not recover." For the doctors present, her words seemed less like poetry than a diagnosis no mortal should be capable of making. Even Confederate surgeon Dr. Hunter McGuire, captured during the battle, while treating his own wounded, could not dismiss what he witnessed. He described Elizabeth moving through the wreckage of Pickett's charge with a calm mastery that exceeded anything in his European training. Her examinations, he wrote, were unlike any method he had seen, and her predictions of life and death surpassed the bounds of medical probability. Elizabeth Caldwell's reputation at Gettysburg did not end with the gun's silence on July 4th. What she did in the days of slaughter was unlike anything the Union Army's medical establishment or the broader scientific community had ever confronted. Dozens of witnesses described her uncanny diagnostic ability. She placed her hands on wounded men's chests and declared internal hemorrhages invisible to conventional methods, and every time, surgery proved her right. Confederate Captain Morrison's case was the most striking. He seemed stable with only a shallow chest wound, yet Elizabeth predicted his imminent death. Hours later, an autopsy confirmed she had been correct. His heart cavity was flooded with blood no surgeon could have detected without opening him. When Dr. Jonathan Letterman, the Union Army's medical director, compiled his official reports, he found himself staring at a bureaucratic nightmare. Over 60 surgeon stewards and chaplains had independently documented Elizabeth Caldwell performing acts that no rational medical theory could explain. She had been seen in multiple locations at the same time. She possessed an apparent knowledge of anatomy and battlefield medicine that could only have come from decades of experience, yet she looked no older than 30. Her stamina, composure, and even her apparent ability to alter the behavior of soldiers in combat had been verified by officers with impeccable reputations. Letterman's confidential summary to Surgeon General William Hammond, completed in August 1863, was written in the flat, precise tone of a man who wanted no misunderstanding of his words. The case of Mrs. Elizabeth Caldwell presents medical anomalies that exceed the explanatory power of current scientific knowledge, he wrote. Multiple credible witnesses, including experienced military surgeons, have documented her presence in locations unreachable under human limitations. Her medical knowledge and physical endurance suggest long years of experience. Yet her appearance remains consistent with that of a woman no older than 30. After consultation with leading authorities at Harvard Johns Hopkins and the University of Pennsylvania, I can offer no rational explanation. His recommendation was stark: classify the matter at the highest level and place Elizabeth under military intelligence observation for the remainder of the war. When questioned directly, Elizabeth gave answers that only thickened the mystery. To Letterman's inquiry about the contradictions in her presence at Gettysburg, she replied with calm dismissal, "Doctor, I have dedicated my life to alleviating suffering wherever it occurs. If my presence brings comfort to the wounded, is that not more important than academic curiosities about my methods? Time moves differently for those who have witnessed as much pain as I have. Perhaps your witnesses are simply confused by the chaos of battle." Her words deflected without denying, offering nothing that could be pinned down. Unsatisfied, Letterman arranged for a full medical examination in Washington, D.C. in September 1863. A panel of 3 respected physicians, including Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Senior, professor of anatomy at Harvard, and one of the most distinguished medical men in America, conducted the study. The results, sealed under confidential medical anomaly investigation, recorded findings that defied the very science they practiced. Elizabeth appeared to be between 28 and 32 years of age. Her skin musculature and bone density showed no signs of the wear or decline expected in a woman who had lived through more than 2 decades of documented history. Every measurement, every observation confirmed the same unsettling fact: time had not touched her. Dr. Holmes's panel delivered a report that should have closed the matter with clinical detachment. Yet instead it read like a catalog of impossibilities. Every test confirmed that Elizabeth Caldwell's body belonged to a woman in her late 20s. Her skin retained full elasticity, her hair showed no graying or thinning, and her teeth displayed the enamel thickness of someone decades younger than her documented age. Even her bones, assessed through palpation and stress tests, showed strength beyond the expected peak for any woman. And yet, her hands told another story. Calluses and scars marked the long years of surgical work, the unmistakable wear of someone who had handled scalpels, needles, and bone saws through hundreds of procedures. Her knowledge deepened the contradiction. Questioned about advanced techniques, Elizabeth spoke with the fluency of a surgeon who had participated in countless major operations. She described procedures still being debated in European journals as if she had performed them dozens of times. The panel concluded that her apparent age and her lived experience could not coexist in any rational framework. The examination also brought forth one of the strangest pieces of evidence in her case: the failure of photography. Using the new albumin print process, Holmes arranged for multiple exposures under varied lighting and cameras. Each attempt either returned a blank plate or produced a hazy silhouette, as if her image resisted capture. Holmes had dismissed earlier reports of photographic failures at Gettysburg as technical mistakes, but now, under his own supervision, the mystery repeated itself. To the eye, she was perfectly visible, but to the camera, she was little more than a blur. When investigators compared her Washington examination with records stretching back to 1840, the truth grew undeniable. Across 23 years of medical files, documented by different physicians preserved in different hospitals, Elizabeth Caldwell had not aged. Height, weight, bone structure, and skin condition remained nearly identical. Where there should have been the slow creep of age, there was only stasis. The deeper the military probed, the stranger her background became. Thomas Caldwell, her husband, had supposedly died of typhoid fever in Baltimore in early 1863, yet his death certificate proved suspicious. The attending physician could not recall treating him, and the hospital listed on the certificate had no record of his admission. Investigators turned next to Elizabeth's maiden name, Hartwell, and uncovered an even more disturbing contradiction. Philadelphia records listed an Elizabeth Hartwell, who had died in 1824 at the age of 6. Either the woman walking hospital wards in 1863 was lying about her identity, or the official record itself concealed something far stranger. Colonel Lafayette Baker, head of military intelligence, took charge of the case. His agents interviewed more than 200 witnesses who claimed encounters with Elizabeth Caldwell between 1840 and 1863. Their accounts collected from Baltimore society matrons, immigrant dock workers, Union and Confederate soldiers, and respected physicians alike painted a portrait disturbingly consistent. She never changed. Her face, her form, her presence remained the same across decades. Her medical skill surpassed that of the best-trained doctors, and wherever she appeared, survival rates surged far beyond expectation. The trail of Elizabeth Caldwell ended as suddenly as it had begun. For more than 2 decades, her presence had been woven into Baltimore's medical records, into the testimonies of soldiers, surgeons, and chaplains, and finally, into the most scrutinized reports of the Civil War. Yet by late 1863, she simply vanished. What investigators uncovered only deepened the mystery. No record existed of her before 1840. Not a baptism, not a school enrollment, not even a passing mention in family genealogies. It was as if she had stepped fully formed into Baltimore society, already married, already bearing the name Caldwell. When she disappeared from Armory Square Hospital in Washington on November 17, 1863, she left everything behind: her surgical kit, her annotated medical texts, even a note written in her steady hand. "My work here is completed. The wounded will heal, and the war will end as all wars do. Time will reveal what time will reveal." Union investigators scoured the eastern seaboard for signs of her. Train conductors, hotel clerks, and ship captains were interviewed, but none had seen her. Some speculated she defected south, but Confederate hospital records showed no trace of a woman matching her description. By the spring of 1864, the Army's investigation stalled. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton ordered the case permanently classified, citing the risk of public panic if news spread that military surgeons had documented a woman whose existence defied science. The official conclusion was carefully worded. Elizabeth Caldwell was a medical anomaly beyond current scientific understanding. She had been observed at Gettysburg by dozens of reputable witnesses, her knowledge genuine, her physical condition inexplicable. Fraud was ruled out, deception dismissed. And so the file was sealed, buried in government archives, where it would remain untouched for a century. When the case resurfaced briefly during the 1963 centennial of Gettysburg, the reaction was one of disbelief. Historians flipped through pages of sworn testimony and meticulous medical notes, but most shrugged them off as the product of battlefield stress, clerical mistakes, or soldiers misremembering amid trauma. Only a handful of researchers dared take the record seriously, and they were dismissed as fringe theorists. Yet the fact remained: the witnesses who testified to Elizabeth Caldwell's impossible nature were surgeons, officers, and chaplains whose reputations were unblemished in every other respect. Modern medicine offers theories that Civil War doctors could not genetic disorders affecting aging, rare endocrine conditions, or even psychological phenomena influencing memory. But none of these explanations fully account for the consistency of Elizabeth's records, the photographic anomalies, the uncanny accuracy of her diagnoses, or the fact that she vanished without trace. What remains is a story written across 2 decades of history. The story of a woman who appeared immune to time, who healed the dying on the bloodiest fields of America, and who walked out of the record one November night, never to be seen again. Genetic science today offers theories that might explain part of Elizabeth Caldwell's legend. Certain growth hormone deficiencies or rare forms of hypopituitarism can slow aging so drastically that an individual appears decades younger than their true years. Combined with sharp intelligence, an exceptional memory, and relentless observation, such a condition might create the illusion of timelessness and extraordinary skill. Her uncanny diagnostic accuracy may have been the product of experience amplified by intuition, sharpened by years in wards and battlefield tents. And the conflicting reports of her appearing in multiple places during Gettysburg could, in a more skeptical light, be attributed to the chaos of war, the fog of memory, and the human tendency to mythologize what seems extraordinary. But even with modern frameworks, questions persist. How did a woman with no documented formal education acquire surgical abilities that surpassed trained physicians? What biological quirk or unknown factor allowed her to endure back-breaking labor without fatigue while others collapsed around her? Why did cameras consistently fail to capture her image, even under the most controlled conditions? And most haunting of all, where did she go after November 18th? 1863? Did she die quietly under another name? Or did she simply move on to the next battlefield, as she hinted where time will reveal? What time will reveal? The story of Elizabeth Caldwell remains one of the most thoroughly documented medical mysteries in American history. Unlike folklore or rumor, her case rests on sworn testimony from surgeons' officers, chaplains, and soldiers' witnesses whose credibility was solid in every other respect. The Civil War produced vast archives of medical observation, but none match the consistency, scale, or baffling nature of this case. For more than 160 years, it has stood as an unresolved riddle at the intersection of medicine history and the unexplainable. Perhaps Elizabeth was an extraordinary individual whose rare condition was misunderstood by 19th century science. Perhaps some elements of her story truly defy explanation. Either way, her presence at Gettysburg remains a reminder that even in an age obsessed with documentation, some mysteries refuse to be solved. So, what do you think? Was Elizabeth Caldwell simply a woman born with rare medical conditions that gave her the appearance of eternal youth? Or was she something beyond human understanding? Leave a comment and let us know your theory. And if you enjoyed this journey into one of America's strangest forgotten stories, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this tale with someone who loves a good historical mystery. In our next video, we'll uncover another secret history that official records tried to bury.